7 months since goodbye, and the sun was beginning to fall behind the town again. The grocery store looked exactly as it had the day he left: rows of canned soup, the soft hum of the refrigerators, the tired shuffle of checkout lines. Ethan hadn't meant to stop here. He told himself he only needed milk, maybe bread, maybe nothing at all. But fate often hides inside errands, small and ordinary. He was halfway down the aisle when he saw her. Lena. The world contracted to the slow motion of her hand resting on the counter, the soft outline of a life he thought he'd lost. Time didn't just stop, it stumbled. 7 months since goodbye, and she was carrying the one thing he thought he'd never see again. Her hand curved instinctively over the roundness of her belly. His breath caught, the sound of the store blurred into silence. In that single instant, every word he'd said, every door he hadn't opened, every night spent convincing himself he'd done the right thing, came crashing back like thunder inside a closed room. The lights above flickered, a cart rolled past, someone laughed near the dairy aisle. And still, he stood there, anchored by shock, by guilt, by awe. She turned. Their eyes met for a heartbeat, nothing more. But that heartbeat rewrote everything. The story of Ethan and Lena hadn't ended. It had only been waiting for this moment to begin again. Long before that night in the store, there was laughter, light, easy, impossible to forget. It began on a humid afternoon at a volunteer build site, where strangers learned to turn wood and nails into shelter. She laughed when she dropped a hammer, he offered to teach her how to hold it. The sound of her laughter lodged somewhere beneath his ribs and never left. Days became weeks, and walls rose from foundation to frame. Between planks and paint, they built something else, an understanding, a rhythm. He admired her stubbornness, she admired his patience. By the time the project ended, neither could imagine the workday without the other. Their first date wasn't planned. It was an accident of timing, two people too reluctant to say goodbye at sunset. They walked through town until the streetlights came on, sharing stories that didn't need to be finished to be understood. Months later, under the rafters of an old barn strung with fairy lights, they said vows that promised forever. The air smelled of cedar and summer. Friends toasted. Music played. And for a while, forever seemed like something they could hold. They talked about children then, someday, not soon. About a house with wide windows. About laughter echoing through rooms they hadn't even built. But time has a way of testing the strength of beams, both in houses and in hearts. Ethan's construction business faltered when a client defaulted. One missed payment became two. Bills stacked like bricks without mortar. Nights grew longer. Silence filled the spaces where laughter used to live. Pride told him he could fix it alone. Worry told her they needed help. They spoke in fragments, in sighs, in half-sentences that ended with someone walking away. Then, one evening, she told him she was pregnant. For a moment, joy flared, bright and brief, before fear smothered it. He thought of debt, of failure, of how he could barely hold their life together as it was. And in that fear, he said words that would echo longer than he ever intended. Maybe, this isn't the right time for a baby. The sentence broke something invisible but vital. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply turned off the kitchen light and walked out the next morning. The house exhaled her absence like a wound that couldn't close. Days bled into weeks. He told himself she'd call. She didn't. The silence in every room grew heavy enough to move. He wandered through the house touching traces of her. Coffee mug on the shelf, scarf draped over a chair, the faint scent of lavender in the sheets. Every reminder felt like both punishment and prayer. Nights stretched endless. The empty ring box sat open on the dresser like a question he didn't know how to answer. Sometimes he whispered into the dark, "You wanted life. I gave you loss." On the table lay the divorce papers, unsigned for weeks, then signed, then left there like an obituary. And when the ink finally dried, he told himself it was mercy. That letting her go was the only kindness left. But kindness, when laced with regret, becomes something cruel. In that still house, even the walls seemed to grieve. Every clock ticked louder. Every chair waited for someone who wasn't coming back. The world outside moved on, but inside, time knelt and refused to rise. Eventually he learned to function, to eat, to work, to drive, but never to forget. He built new foundations for other people's homes, yet couldn't patch the cracks in his own heart. The nights remained the hardest. The smell of rain still reminded him of her hair, the sound of laughter from passing strangers felt like echoes of what he'd lost. When he finally saw her again, 7 months later in that grocery store, he realized silence had never ended their story, it had only delayed it. Because sometimes love doesn't disappear. It simply waits in the quiet, learning how to speak again. The days after she left blurred into one long season of silence. Ethan lived inside it as though it were weather, constant, gray, unchanging. He went to work, built frames, poured cement, smiled when he had to, but every nail he drove seemed to echo the sound of her closing the door. At night, he sat in the half-lit kitchen with a single lamp burning, the divorce papers folded beside a photo of their wedding day. The laughter in that picture felt like it belonged to someone else. "You wanted life," he whispered to the empty room. "I gave you loss." Outside, rain traced crooked lines down the glass, collecting in small pools that caught the streetlight like shards of memory. The house had been built for two voices. One voice gone, every room felt wider, hollower. Some evenings he'd drift into the nursery that never became one. The walls were bare, the faint smell of paint still clung to the air. He would stand there, listening to nothing, until he almost believed he could hear her humming. The papers remained on the table for days before he signed them. Even then, his hand trembled as if his body refused to agree with his decision. When he set the pen down, the sound was final, small, almost kind. But final all the same. And so he began again, or tried to, each morning like a rehearsal for a life he didn't quite believe in. Work filled the hours, noise filled the silence, and the ache settled somewhere deep enough to pretend it wasn't there. Months later, fate brought him back to that grocery store. He hadn't expected anything more than another ordinary day. But the universe rarely asks permission to change a man's story. When he saw her, when he saw what she carried, something inside him cracked open. 7 months of distance collapsed into a single, breathless heartbeat. She turned. Their eyes met. She left. He followed, too late. The sliding doors closed between them with a whisper that felt like thunder. He stepped outside into the sunset, watching her car pull away, and the world suddenly looked both familiar and foreign, like a map rewritten in an old language he was just beginning to remember. That night, sleep would not come. He replayed the moment again and again, the curve of her belly, the way her hand rested protectively there, the flash of recognition in her eyes before she looked away. There were 1,000 things he wanted to say. None of them felt enough. The next morning, he decided silence had lasted long enough. He started searching. Not with hope, exactly, but with something quieter. The need to know she was all right. He drove past the old construction yard at dawn. Mist hung low over the half-built homes, and the frame of an unfinished house rose against the light like a skeleton waiting for skin. He stood there for a while, fingers tracing the grain of wood, and wondered if hearts repaired themselves the same way, piece by piece, nail by nail. Then he drove into town, stopping at places that still carried her echo. The cafe where she once sat by the window, sketching plans on napkins. The community center where she used to volunteer. The bench by the river where they'd dreamed out loud. Everyone remembered her smile. No one knew where she'd gone. Finally, at the old volunteer office, a receptionist recognized the name. "She moved," she said gently. "Out past Willow Creek Road." He thanked her, though his throat was tight. Driving there, he noticed how the world had kept going without him, the shops repainted, the fields greener, the air carrying a different season. Each mile felt heavier. Each turn carried another question he was afraid to ask. What would he say if she opened the door? Could apology fill 7 months of silence? The road narrowed into gravel, trees closing in overhead. And then, at the edge of town, he saw it, a small apartment complex painted a tired yellow, porch light flickering like a heartbeat. He parked, engine idling, hands still gripping the wheel. Through the rain, he could just make out her name on the mailbox, letters faded but certain. He didn't move. Didn't knock. Didn't breathe for a moment. Inside one window, a light came on. A silhouette moved past the curtain. Familiar. Distant. He reached for the door handle, then stopped. The fear of being unwanted was heavier than the rain itself. So he sat there in the quiet hum of the storm, watching the porch light blink in and out, a rhythm that felt almost like forgiveness. He'd built homes all his life, he thought, but he'd never learned how to rebuild a heart. Hours passed. The clock on the dashboard read 11:47 when he finally started the engine. The headlights carved a path through the rain as he drove away, the apartment shrinking in the rearview mirror until it was just another blur of gold against the dark. But something had changed. The silence inside him was different now, not empty, but alive, waiting. For the first time in months, he felt the faintest pulse of purpose. Hope, maybe. Or something that sounded a lot like it. The rain returned without warning. Heavy. Relentless. The kind that blurs the line between sky and road. Ethan had been driving home from another late shift when the headlights caught movement ahead. A car stopped on the roadside, hazard lights pulsing weakly through the storm. He might have passed by if not for something in that shape, that stillness, that silhouette that memory recognized before reason did. It was her. 7 months of distance, and now she stood in the rain, trying to coax life back into a stranded engine. Water soaked her hair, clung to her coat, shimmered beneath the flashes of lightning. He slowed, heart in his throat. He could hear nothing but the drum of rain on metal. He stopped. Got out. Every drop stung like confession. She turned at the sound of his footsteps. For a moment neither spoke, just the rain between them, saying everything words couldn't. He took the wrench from her shaking hand and knelt beside the car, pretending to study the tire, the engine, anything to give his hands something to do while his heart unraveled. They worked together in silence. The storm eased just enough for him to breathe. He offered her his umbrella when the wind shifted, the gesture small but trembling with memory. For a heartbeat she hesitated, then took it. Beneath that fragile circle of fabric, the world shrank to 2 people, one regret, and the sound of rain becoming forgiveness. When she finally spoke, her voice carried both hurt and strength. "You don't get to rescue me now, Ethan." He nodded, rain running down his face. "Not trying to," he whispered. And still, she didn't walk away. The storm washed over them. 2 figures under the dim halo of an umbrella, caught between ending and beginning. Some moments don't change anything, and yet somehow, they change everything. That night, after she drove off, he stood in the rain until dawn. It wasn't punishment anymore. It was something else, penance, perhaps. Or prayer. He drove home soaked to the bone but lighter than he'd felt in months. Because for the first time, she hadn't turned away completely. In the days that followed, Ethan found small ways to be near her world without stepping into it. He learned she still lived near the edge of town, still worked mornings at the clinic, still kept to herself. So he helped quietly. Fixed what he could without being seen. Left groceries by her door. Paid an overdue bill or 2. Tuned up her car in the night and vanished before sunrise. He never left a note. Never waited for thanks. Every small repair felt like one brick lifted from the wall between them. Guilt had taught him distance. Love was now teaching him gentleness. She began to notice. Packages arrived without senders' names. Gas tank mysteriously full. A creak in the front steps suddenly gone. She knew. She always did. And one afternoon, as he loaded lumber into his truck, she appeared. Rain threatened again, clouds curling low over the rooftops. She didn't look angry. Just tired. "You can't buy forgiveness," she said. He met her eyes, calm now, older somehow. "Then let me earn it." There was no reply. Only a pause, long, fragile, real. She sighed, voice soft as the wind. "Doctor's appointment. Friday." She turned to leave before he could answer, but he didn't need to. That was invitation enough. Friday came wrapped in sunlight. He arrived early, standing outside the clinic, hands shaking in his pockets. Inside, she waited, sitting in a pale green chair, pretending to read a magazine she hadn't turned in 5 minutes. When she looked up, he smiled, not the old smile, but something quieter, steadier. It wasn't forgiveness yet, just a doorway left unlocked. A small step. But small steps are how redemption learns to walk. From that moment, the rhythm of their days changed. Ethan began to drive her to checkups. They spoke little at first, words cautious like newborn birds. But silence eventually softened into conversation, simple things, small things. The weather. The roads. The kind of small talk that slowly becomes trust. He started fixing the nursery she'd once begun. Paint cans appeared by her door. He sanded the crib, rolled new color onto the walls, replaced what time had worn down. She joined in, brush in hand, sleeves rolled up, laughter finally returning to her eyes. They spilled paint, argued over shades, laughed again. The laughter surprised them both, like a song they hadn't realized they still knew. One evening they sat on the floor amid open boxes, sharing takeout and stories of the months apart. She spoke of fear, of becoming a mother alone, of carrying something that once felt like a reminder but had become her reason. He listened, not to respond, but to understand. For the first time, silence didn't divide them, it held them. Days passed, gentle and ordinary. He replaced broken bulbs, she made coffee. They built something fragile and precious, consistency. Trust returned not as thunder but as sunrise, slow, golden, certain. One night, after painting until dusk, they stepped onto the porch. The air was cool, crickets sang somewhere in the grass. She handed him a mug of coffee, he handed her quiet companionship. The sky shifted from amber to deep blue, and for a moment, everything they'd lost felt possible again. For the first time in months, the house sounded like home. Filled not with echoes, but with laughter. Healing didn't announce itself with trumpets. It arrived softly, like the smell of paint drying or the whisper of rain on a newly cleaned window. And in that quiet, careful peace, they began again. Not as they were, but as who they'd become. Night returned the way fear always does, quiet at first, then suddenly everywhere. The rain had begun again, tapping against the window of Lena's apartment while the clock blinked 11:42 p.m. She sat folding baby clothes, humming under her breath, when the first pain caught her mid-note. Another followed. Then another. She tried to breathe through it, whispering calm words to herself, but the tremor in her voice betrayed the truth, it was too soon. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone. One name still sat at the top of the list, the name she swore she'd never dial again. She hesitated only a second before pressing it. Across town, Ethan was half asleep at his desk, surrounded by sketches of unfinished houses, when the ringtone cut through the dark. He saw her name and didn't think, he simply moved. Keys in hand. Door flung open. Rain soaking him before the truck engine even started. Fear once made him freeze, the voice inside him said. Tonight, it makes him fly. Tires hissed on wet asphalt, wipers beating time with thunder. Streetlights blurred into streaks of gold as he sped through the sleeping town, whispering the only prayer he knew, "Please let her be okay." When he reached the apartment, she was standing by the stairwell, pale but steady, holding her belly with one hand and the railing with the other. Their eyes met, and for the first time since the day she left, neither looked away. He caught her as another wave hit. Her breath came fast, shallow. "Don't you dare leave again," she said between gasps. "Not this time," he answered. And he didn't. They moved together through rain, through streets that glistened like mirrors. The hospital doors opened in a rush of light, and suddenly the world was white and clean and filled with motion. He stayed beside her through every moment, hand in hand, breath for breath. He didn't speak much, there was nothing words could add. Hours blurred. Monitors beeped steady. Nurses moved with calm purpose. Somewhere between one heartbeat and the next, calm returned. When the doctor finally smiled and said, "She's stable," Ethan's knees nearly gave out. He sat beside Lena's bed, her fingers still wrapped in his, the storm outside breaking into silence. Peace arrived softly, like dawn creeping through curtains. For the first time in months, he wasn't running from anything, he was exactly where he was meant to be. Weeks passed. The world shifted from gray to gold again. Morning light poured through hospital blinds as the sound of a newborn's cry filled the room. Ethan stood frozen, eyes wide, as life announced itself in one raw, perfect note. He had imagined this moment 100 different ways, but nothing came close. Every regret, every sleepless night, every word unsaid folded into that single cry. Lena smiled through tears, whispering the name they had chosen together. Faith. "Because she's what we lost," she said, voice trembling, "and found again." He nodded, tears spilling freely now. In that instant he understood that redemption doesn't arrive with trumpets or lightning. It comes as a heartbeat, small and fierce, reminding you that grace is still possible. Morning wrapped the room in gold. Faith slept against her mother's chest, Ethan stood by the window watching the city wake. The world felt brand new. Not because everything was perfect, but because they finally were not afraid to begin again. 3 months later, sunlight followed them down the same road that once led to heartbreak. The truck hummed softly through the fields, baby laughter filling the cab. Ahead stood the old barn, the one where forever had once been promised and then lost. Now, it waited for them again, mended and glowing under strings of lights. Friends and family gathered in a half-circle. Laughter replaced the ghosts that once lived in those rafters. Lena wore a simple dress, Faith slept in her arms. Ethan's hands shook only slightly as he took hers. There were no speeches, no grandeur. Just the sound of breathing, the hush of wind through open doors, and 2 voices learning to say yes again. She looked at him, eyes shining. "You built this life back, brick by brick." He smiled, tears threatening but refusing to fall. "No," he said softly. "You're the foundation." The guests applauded, but their hearts spoke louder. They weren't celebrating perfection, they were witnessing restoration. Candles flickered, casting halos across the beams. Faith stirred, a tiny sigh escaping her lips, as if even she understood what this moment meant. The music swelled, soft strings, the same melody that once played on their wedding night, now slower, gentler, wiser. They exchanged rings again, the old ones polished, their weight familiar but new. Around them, laughter returned. Dinner, dancing, small jokes whispered under twinkle lights. Life had texture again. It was rough and uneven and real. Later, when the guests drifted home, Ethan and Lena stood outside the barn watching the lights sway in the wind. The air smelled of rain and hay and forgiveness. In the distance, a baby's laughter rolled from the house nearby. The sound folded the night in half, a perfect seam. He looked at the sky, stars scattered like nails in dark wood, and thought about how many times he had tried to rebuild his life. Every attempt failed until he learned that foundations aren't made of plans, they're made of people. The dawn crept up behind the hills. Light spilled through the barn windows, catching dust in its glow, turning the air golden. Some love stories end where they began. Theirs began again where it once ended. They didn't chase a perfect life. They built a real one, out of mistakes forgiven, laughter rediscovered, and a child named Faith who reminded them that even broken hearts can learn the rhythm of joy again.